The seventh guest never left the manor, a Sherlock Holmes mystery. Chapter 1. A letter sealed in black wax. It was the third week of November, 1894, when London lay smothered beneath a fog so dense that the gas lamps along Baker Street appeared as no more than smudges of weak orange floating in a grey void, and the cabs that passed beneath our windows moved at the pace of mourners following a hearse. I had spent the better part of the afternoon attending a difficult confinement in Marylebone, and I returned to find Sherlock Holmes seated by the fire, his dressing gown wrapped tightly about him, turning over an envelope in his long fingers with an expression of unusual gravity. For Holmes, who treated most correspondence with the contemptuous speed of a man swatting flies, rarely lingered over an unopened letter. "Ah, Watson," he said without looking up, though how he knew my step upon the stair from among the dozen other tenants of our building, I had long since ceased to question. "You have walked the length of Marylebone Road in this murk, and yet you stopped twice. Once, I should say, to assist an elderly woman whose parcel had split upon the pavement, and once to consult your watch beneath a lamp, uncertain whether you were late for some appointment you have not yet mentioned to me." "Holmes, this is becoming tiresome," I said, though I could not entirely suppress a smile as I shrugged off my overcoat and hung it upon the peg by the door. "How could you possibly deduce such a thing from my arrival alone? Your left glove is soiled with a fine white powder that no baker leaves lying about his pavement without consequence to a passer-by's clothing, and the soiling runs in a curve consistent with stooping to gather scattered goods rather than mere brushing contact. Your boots, though damp throughout from the general wet of the fog, show a peculiar patch of dryness upon the toes, consistent with standing motionless beneath an awning for some minutes, which a man does not do without reason, and the reason that suggests itself most readily on a fog-bound evening is the consultation of a timepiece beneath available light. Trivial matters, Watson, scarcely worth the breath I have spent explaining them. This," he held up the envelope between two fingers, "as a man might hold a curious insect, is rather less trivial." I crossed the room and accepted the letter he extended toward me. It was of heavy cream stock, the sort favoured by old county families who had never troubled to economise upon their stationery, whatever the state of their finances, sealed with black wax bearing the impression of an oak tree, and addressed in a hand both elegant in its formation and visibly unsteady in its execution, the hand, I judged, of an educated man writing under considerable strain. "Black wax," I murmured, turning the envelope over. "Mourning, evidently." "Or melodrama," said Holmes, though there was little humour in his tone. "I confess the contents trouble me more than I care to admit before I have even properly examined the scene they describe. Read it aloud, if you would, Watson. I find I wish to hear it in another voice, that I may judge it the more dispassionately." I broke the seal. It cracked with the brittle finality of wax some days old, suggesting the letter had been written, hesitated over, and finally dispatched only after some delay, and read aloud. "Mr. Holmes, I write to you in a state of terror, I am ashamed to confess, even upon paper, and which I have confessed to no living soul in this house, for I do not know whom among them I may yet trust. My name is Edmund Thraxworth, and I am the eldest son of the late Sir Aldous Thraxworth of Greywater Manor, in the county of Surrey, a family of some standing in this part of England for above 4 generations. 1 week ago this Tuesday past, my father held a dinner for 6 guests, as was his custom upon the 2nd Tuesday of every month, the 7th chair at our table reserved, as is our family's peculiar and long-standing custom, for an unseen guest, a tradition dating to my grandfather's time, said to honour a debt owed to a stranger who once saved our family from financial ruin in circumstances none of us now living fully understand. The chair has stood empty at every meal for 30 years. I had thought it nothing more than a charming eccentricity, the sort of harmless superstition that attaches itself to old families like ivy to old stone. That night, my father retired to his study after the meal, as was equally his habit, to smoke a single cigar before bed, and was never seen alive again. The door was locked from within by his own hand, as I myself witnessed when I bid him good night at the threshold. The window's iron latch was found rusted shut, untouched, the local constable assures me. For the better part of a decade, he tested it himself and could not move it without the application of oil and considerable force. And yet my father was found at dawn by his valet, seated in his chair at the desk, quite dead, his face wearing an expression of such terror that I have not been able to close my own eyes since without seeing it before me, and the chair reserved for the unseen guest, which had stood empty and untouched throughout the dinner as it always does, was found, when I passed the dining room near midnight, pushed back from the table as though someone had only just risen from it, a single fork laid crosswise upon its plate, though no food had been served there. The county surgeon has ruled the cause of death apoplexy, a seizure of the heart brought on, he supposes, by some excitement or strain my father did not share with the family. I do not believe him, Mr. Holmes, though I could not say precisely why, beyond an instinct I cannot silence. There is something wrong in this house, something that moves beneath the surface of our ordinary mourning, and I am afraid that if I do not seek help from outside this family, the truth, whatever shape it takes, will be buried along with my father this coming Friday, and never disturbed again. I beg you to come to Greywater before the funeral. I will meet whatever fee you ask. I ask only that you come quickly, and that you come prepared to doubt every comfortable explanation this household will offer you. For I fear we are none of us so innocent as we appear, myself perhaps least of all, for I cannot say with certainty what I myself heard or did not hear that night. So disordered has my mind become with grief and suspicion both. Your servant in desperate hope, Edmund Thraxworth. I lowered the page slowly. A locked room, Holmes, your favourite species of impossibility, and a man's own son confessing he cannot trust his own memory of the night. That is an unusual admission to make to a stranger. There are no impossibilities, Watson, only inadequately examined possibilities. I have told you this 100 times, and shall doubtless tell you 100 more before either of us tires of the lesson. He rose and reached for his pipe, filling it with the slow, deliberate motions of a man whose mind is already racing far ahead of his hands. But I confess the detail of the empty chair, pushed back as though vacated, interests me a great deal more than the locked door, which is, after all, merely a puzzle of mechanics, hinges, latches, chimneys, the ordinary furniture of deception. A chair that appears to have been occupied by no one is a puzzle of an altogether more interesting order. Psychology, Watson, not engineering. Someone wished it to be believed, by at least one member of that household, that the seventh guest had at last arrived. The question that intrigues me is not how such an illusion was contrived. The question is why anyone should go to such trouble to contrive it, and what they hope to gain by a son's glimpse of a disturbed chair in the dead of night. Perhaps it was no illusion at all. Holmes's eyes glinted with something between amusement and reproof. Watson, I had hoped 15 years of friendship might have inoculated you somewhat against superstition. Pack your bag. There is a train from Waterloo at 20 minutes to 7, and I should like to view the scene before the funeral robs us of whatever evidence the family has not already trampled in its grief. Chapter 2. Greywater Manor. The fog had not lifted by the time our train deposited us at the small Surrey station of Pellinghurst, a single platform lit by 2 gas lamps and attended by a porter who regarded our London clothes with the frank curiosity small stations reserve for strangers. The carriage that carried us the 3 miles to Greywater Manor moved through a landscape of skeletal hedgerows and silent fields, the kind of grey, dripping countryside that seems designed by nature expressly to unsettle a Londoner's nerves and remind him how very far he has travelled from the comforting clamour of the city. Holmes said little during the journey, though I observed him watching the passing fields with the particular intensity he reserved for the early stages of an investigation. when every detail of a case's setting might yet prove material. "An isolated house," he murmured once, half to himself. "No neighbours within calling distance, judging by the absence of other lights. A household entirely dependent upon its own resources and its own silence. That is a useful condition for a murderer, Watson, and an equally useful condition for a family wishing to conceal one." Greywater Manor itself rose suddenly from a stand of ancient yews as our carriage rounded a final bend, a great Jacobean pile of dark stone, its many chimneys cold but for one thin thread of smoke rising from what I took to be the kitchens, its windows lit here and there with the thin, defensive light of a household in mourning that has not yet learned how to occupy its own rooms comfortably again. An owl called somewhere in the yews as we descended from the carriage, and I confess the sound, ordinary as it was, raised the hair upon my neck in a manner I should have been ashamed to admit to Holmes. Edmund Thraxworth met us at the door himself, dismissing the footman who had moved to announce us with an impatient gesture, as though he could not bear even the small delay of formal introduction. He was a pale young man of perhaps 30, slender, with the hollow eyes and bitten nails of one who had not slept properly since his father's death, and his hand, when he shook mine, trembled very slightly. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, thank God you have come. I confess I half feared my letter would strike you as the ravings of an overwrought son, unable to accept a natural death." He led us through a hall hung with the portraits of generations of Thraxworths, stern men in ruffs and stocks and high collars, whose painted eyes seemed to follow our progress with the particular disapproval old portraits reserve for visitors, and into a drawing-room where a small fire struggled gamely against a chill that seemed to rise from the very stones of the house. "Tell me of the dinner," said Holmes, settling into a chair without removing his coat, a sure sign that he intended to proceed directly to the heart of the matter, rather than indulge in the social preliminaries most clients expected. "Every detail, Mr. Thraxworth, however small it may seem to you, who sat where, who spoke to whom, and upon what subjects, what was eaten, what was drunk, and at what precise hour each guest finally withdrew from your father's company." Edmund passed a trembling hand across his face, as though physically wiping away the effort of recollection. There were 6 of us at table that evening, besides my father, who sat as always at the head, beneath the portrait of his own father, old Josiah, whom you will see frowning down upon you in the hall as you came through. To his right sat my uncle, Mortimer Thraxworth, my father's younger brother, who has managed the family's investments in the city these 9 years past. Beside him sat Dr. Sylvester Crane, our family physician these 30 years, and an old, close friend of my father's since their school days together. Across from him sat my fiancée, Miss Iris Whitfield, whom my father had grown genuinely fond of, I believe, despite his initial reservations about the match. Beside her sat my father's solicitor, Mr. Josiah Penrose, who had come down from London that very afternoon, upon some matter of business my father would not discuss before the rest of us. Beside him sat my cousin, Agatha Thraxworth, who has kept this house since my mother's death some 12 years ago, and knows its every corner better than any of us. And at the foot of the table, as always, stood the 7th chair, empty, set with its own plate and glass, which no one in this house has ever touched in my lifetime. "And you yourself, Mr. Thraxworth, where did you sit?" "Between my cousin Agatha and my father, upon his left hand, as is fitting for the eldest son." "What was the particular business that brought the solicitor down from London on that night, rather than by ordinary appointment?" Edmund hesitated, and I observed his eyes flicker briefly toward the door, as though he feared being overheard even within his own drawing-room. "I do not know precisely what passed between them, Mr. Holmes. My father said only, when I asked, that there were matters touching upon the will that he wished settled before he grew any older. His heart had troubled him for some years, you understand, and Dr. Crane had warned him more than once against undue excitement. A new will, drawn upon the very night your father died, and never previously mentioned in your letter to me," said Holmes, his eyes sharpening almost imperceptibly, the way a hawk's eyes sharpen upon the smallest movement in a distant field. "That is a detail of some considerable weight, Mr. Thraxworth. Why was it omitted?" "I did not think it significant beside the manner of his death," Edmund said, though his tone suggested he did not entirely believe his own answer even as he gave it. "Everything is significant, Mr. Thraxworth, until proven otherwise by careful examination, and frequently even afterward in some lesser fashion," said Holmes. "Continue, if you would." "After dinner concluded, your father withdrew, as was his custom, to his study, as always, to smoke a single cigar in solitude before retiring for the night. A habit of 30 years standing that the entire household could set a clock by. He bid us all good night at perhaps 9:30, and I myself walked with him as far as the study door, for I wished to ask him privately whether all was well, having sensed some unusual tension in him throughout the meal. He assured me all was well, entered the room, and I watched him turn the key himself in the lock, as he always did when he wished an evening's true privacy, for he disliked even the servants disturbing his papers once he had settled to his cigar and his thoughts. And in the morning what was discovered? His valet, Hobbs, found him at 7, when he came as every morning to draw the curtains and lay out his clothes, and found the study door still locked fast against him. He knocked, received no answer, grew alarmed, and summoned myself and 2 of the footmen. We broke the door down together. It took 3 considerable blows, for the lock was old and solid oak besides. My father sat in his chair at the desk, quite cold, quite plainly dead some hours, his face wearing an expression I have never before seen on any living man, nor hope to see again, Mr. Holmes. Not pain, precisely, terror, an open-mouthed, wide-eyed terror, as though something had confronted him in those final moments that no ordinary seizure of the heart could explain. And the 7th chair, of which your letter spoke at such length, the servants swear upon their positions that it was set against the table exactly as always when they cleared the dining room at 10 o'clock that night. The plate untouched, the chair drawn neatly in. Yet when I myself passed the dining room at perhaps midnight, unable to settle to sleep for a vague unease I could not then account for, I saw, and I swear to you both, Mr. Holmes, upon whatever you hold sacred, that I was neither dreaming nor drunk, for I had taken no more than a single glass of port that evening. I saw the chair drawn back from the table some 18 inches, precisely as a man draws back a chair when rising from it. The fork that should have lain straight beside the untouched plate instead lay crosswise upon it, as though set down by a hand that had only just finished some meal no one else in this house had served. Holmes was silent for a long moment, his fingers steepled before his lips in the attitude of concentration I had come to know so well, his grey eyes fixed upon some point beyond the drawing-room's walls entirely. "Mr. Thraxworth," he said at last, "I should like to see the study, the dining-room, and to speak in turn with every soul who sat at that table that night, including, and perhaps especially, the servants who cleared it before and laid it after. And I should very much like to know the full contents of the will your father intended to sign that evening, and whether, by whatever means, he in fact succeeded in signing it before death overtook him." A new and stricken look crossed Edmund's already pale face, and he sank into the chair opposite, as though his legs had suddenly failed to support him. "That is the strangest circumstance of all, Mr. Holmes, and the one that has driven me very nearly to distraction these past 7 days. The will was found upon his desk that very morning, in the locked study, fully signed and properly witnessed, dated that same night after dinner. And yet Mr. Penrose, the solicitor, swears upon his professional honour that my father never summoned him again after their conversation in the library, and that he himself retired to the guest wing at 10 o'clock precisely and saw my father no more that night, alive or otherwise." Chapter 3. The Locked Study. Holmes spent above an hour in Sir Aldous' study, and I have rarely seen him work with such silent, methodical intensity, even in the course of our long acquaintance. The room was modest for a manor of that considerable size, a heavy oak desk scarred by decades of use, shelves crowded with legal volumes and works of natural history that suggested a mind of broader curiosity than mere estate management would require, a single tall window whose iron latch was, as promised, fused immovably with the rust of years, and a fireplace, cold now, its grate swept clean by some dutiful housemaid who had performed her ordinary morning task without yet knowing she tidied a murder scene. Holmes examined the door first, kneeling upon the worn carpet to study the lock with his pocket glass for fully 10 minutes, then rising to inspect the splintered frame itself, where the wood had given way under the combined weight of 3 desperate men. The lock was genuinely engaged from within at the moment the door was forced, he murmured, more to himself than to me, in the low, rapid muttering that meant his mind had outrun ordinary conversation entirely. No scratches suggestive of a false key worked clumsily in darkness, no marks upon the bolt consistent with picking by an unpracticed hand, and the key itself, I am told, was discovered in his waistcoat pocket, precisely where a man places it after locking a door from within and settling to his evening's solitary pleasure. Whoever locked this door, Watson, locked it as Sir Aldous himself was understood by every soul in this house to do, from the inside, with his own key, in his own habitual fashion. Then how could anyone else have entered Holmes, let alone departed again, leaving the door locked behind them? Patience, Watson, a virtue your profession ought to have instilled in you more thoroughly than it apparently has. He moved next to the window, testing the rusted latch with a strength that genuinely surprised me, satisfying himself through considerable effort that it had not moved from its fused position in a great many years, the rust flaking away in small reddish-brown crumbs that fell to the sill below. He examined the chimney next, thrusting his arm fully up into the flue and withdrawing it black with soot to the elbow but otherwise empty-handed, his expression betraying nothing of disappointment. For I had observed before that Holmes derived as much satisfaction from eliminating a possibility as from confirming one. He examined the floorboards minutely upon his hands and knees, the desk drawers one by one, and finally the wastepaper basket beside the desk, from which he extracted, with a small exclamation of genuine triumph, a torn fragment of paper bearing a few words in a cramped, evidently hurried hand, the ink blotted in places as though written in some agitation. "What have you found?" I asked, crossing to peer over his shoulder. He held the fragment to the grey light filtering through the window. The torn scrap read only, "Cannot allow the truth of the ledger to," the remainder torn away entirely, leaving the sentence forever incomplete. "A ledger," Holmes repeated softly, turning the fragment over to examine its blank reverse, finding nothing further. Mr. Thraxworth's uncle, you will recall, manages the family's investments in the city, a position that affords considerable opportunity for a man so inclined toward dishonesty, and considerable temptation besides, given the easy access to funds that few outside the family would think to scrutinize closely. I think, Watson, we shall want a far closer look at Mortimer Thraxworth's books before this affair reaches any satisfactory conclusion. He turned then to the desk itself, where the signed will still lay beneath a heavy brass paperweight shaped like a crouching lion, awaiting the coroner's eventual release of the study and its contents. Holmes studied the signature with his glass for a considerable while, comparing it letter by letter, I noticed, against an older letter of Sir Aldous' that Edmund had earlier supplied at Holmes's request, a letter concerning some trivial matter of estate business, but bearing, crucially, an undisputed example of the dead man's genuine hand. "The signature is genuine," he said finally, straightening with a small sigh, "or else it is an extraordinarily fine forgery indeed. Finer than any I have encountered in 15 years of careful practice in such matters, and I have encountered a great many forgeries in my time, Watson. some of them executed by men who made their entire dishonest living at the trade. But observe the ink itself, if you would, rather than merely the formation of the letters. He held the page to the window light, tilting it this way and that, to catch the grey illumination at varying angles. See how it sits upon the paper's surface, slightly raised still in places, slightly glossy where the light catches it, though this document purports to be a full week old. Ink of a week's age, exposed to the ordinary air of an English November, does not retain this particular sheen, Watson, however carefully the paper has since been stored. I should say, with reasonable confidence, that this signature is no more than 2 or 3 days old at the very most, which places its execution well after Sir Aldous Thraxworth was already cold in his grave clothes. Then the will, Holmes. The will was signed after Sir Aldous' death. That, my dear Watson, is precisely the question upon which this entire singular affair shall ultimately turn, and I do not yet know its answer with the certainty I should like, though I begin to form a suspicion that troubles me a great deal more than the mechanics of the locked door ever could. You said, next, 10:57 a.m. Claude responded. Chapter 4. The Dining Room and the Seventh Chair, Orchestrated Narrative Expansion Strategy for Extended Storytelling. Orchestrated Narrative Expansion Strategy for Extended Storytelling. Chapter 4. The Dining Room and the Seventh Chair. We proceeded next to the dining room, a long chamber hung with tapestries faded by decades of sun and wood smoke, dominated by a table that might have comfortably seated 20 in grander days, but now stood set for far fewer, its length somehow making the empty places more conspicuous rather than less. Holmes walked its full length slowly, his hand trailing along the polished wood, then knelt at the foot of the table where the seventh chair stood apart from the others by some private convention of the household, set with its lonely plate and glass, exactly as Edmund had described, untouched and faintly dusty, despite the housemaid's evident diligence elsewhere in the room. "Tell me," Holmes said to the housemaid who had been summoned at his request, a nervous girl of perhaps 17 named Bessie, who twisted her apron between her fingers throughout the interview. "Do you clear this particular chair's setting each night, the same as the others at table?" "Yes, sir, always. Cook says it's bad luck else, and Mrs. Agatha is most particular that it be done proper, same as any guest's place. And on the night in question, the night Sir Aldous died, did you notice anything at all different about it when you cleared the table at 10 o'clock, as is your custom?" "No, sir, nothing at all. The chair were in its place same as ever, plate untouched, same as every night these dozen years I've worked here." "And the following morning, when you laid the table again for breakfast, what did you find then?" Bessie's eyes widened slightly at the memory, and she lowered her voice as though the very recollection embarrassed her. "Now that you mention it, sir," the chair were pulled out a little from the table, perhaps a foot or more. "I thought one of the gentlemen must have moved it in the night, looking for something dropped, perhaps, or just restless and wandering as gentlemen sometimes do. And there were a fork lying crossways upon the plate, though nothing had been served there the night before, nor ever is. I thought it queer at the time, sir, very queer indeed, but I didn't like to mention it to anyone, what with the master lying dead upstairs, and the whole house in such an uproar that morning. It seemed a small thing beside so great a tragedy." Holmes thanked her with unusual gentleness. He had a way, when he chose to employ it, of putting frightened witnesses entirely at their ease, though he could be as cold as the Surrey fog when interrogating those he suspected of deliberate falsehood. And when she had gone, curtsying nervously and retreating toward the kitchens, he turned to me with an expression I had learned over many cases to recognize, the particular, almost predatory stillness that meant a piece of the puzzle had clicked satisfyingly into place within that extraordinary mind of his. "Watson, what do we actually know of this family tradition, the seventh chair, the unseen guest, this curious 30-year vigil kept at every meal?" "Only what Edmund told us in his letter, and again this afternoon. A debt owed to a stranger, dating to the grandfather's time, the precise nature of the debt now lost to memory. I should like to know that story in full, and from a source closer to its true heart than a grandson who has only ever known it as inherited custom, said Holmes, rising and brushing the dust of the carpet from his trouser knees. Traditions, Watson, are very rarely preserved across 2 full generations without some genuine and pressing reason beneath the comfortable surface explanation offered to children. And a family that sets a place at its table for a ghost for 30 years running is a family with something it does not wish to examine too closely, even amongst itself. Let us find Cousin Agatha. Housekeepers, in my considerable experience of such households, know a great deal more of a family's true secrets than its solicitors ever trouble to learn, for secrets are kept from lawyers, but rarely successfully kept from the women who manage a house's daily intimacies. Chapter 5. The Keeper of Old Stories. Agatha Thraxworth received us in the small parlour she had evidently made entirely her own within the larger house. A thin, grey-eyed woman of perhaps 50, with the watchful, economical manner of one who has spent a lifetime managing other people's households, and, I suspected within moments of meeting her, other people's secrets besides. The room was tidy to the point of austerity, every object placed with evident deliberation, and I formed the immediate impression of a woman who valued control above almost every other quality life could offer her. "The 7th chair," she said, when Holmes put the question to her directly, without the preliminary courtesies he sometimes employed with more fragile witnesses, "is older than I am myself, Mr. Holmes, and the truth of it is rather less romantic, I think, than Edmund's grandfather liked to tell the children at Christmas, gathered round the fire with their eyes wide and their imaginations primed for ghost stories. Old Josiah Thraxworth, that is, the present Sir Aldous' own father, though I suppose I ought now to say the late Sir Aldous, God rest him, was very nearly ruined entirely in the financial panic of 1857, when half the banking houses of London tottered within a single dreadful fortnight. A stranger came to him in the very depths of that crisis, a man none of the family has ever named to me in all my years in this house, and lent him the capital that saved Greywater from the auctioneer's hammer and the family from genuine, public ruin. The stranger asked only one thing in return for his considerable generosity, that a chair always be kept ready for him at the family table, that he might return one day, whenever he chose, and claim the welcome he had earned but never formally taken. And did he ever in fact return, in all these 30 years? Not that I have ever been told directly, but Josiah took the obligation with great seriousness, almost a religious seriousness, by all the old accounts I have heard, and Aldous after him maintained it faithfully, never once permitting the custom to lapse, even in years of considerable hardship. It became, over time, something very near a household superstition. The family came genuinely to believe that so long as the chair was faithfully kept, the family's fortune would hold steady against whatever storms came. Foolishness, of course, the sort of thing educated people ought to have abandoned generations ago, but old houses cling to old foolishness more tenaciously than you might suppose, Mr. Holmes, having presumably spent your career chiefly amongst the rational classes of London. Was there ever a name attached to this generous stranger, a description of his person, his manner, anything at all that might identify him beyond the bare fact of his charity? Agatha's eyes flickered, very briefly but quite unmistakably to my own observation, toward the parlour window, as though some memory had drawn her gaze involuntarily toward the grounds beyond. There were rumours, when I was a girl new to this house, that the stranger was no stranger at all in truth, that he was in fact a cousin of the family, disinherited and sent away under some old and bitter disgrace the family never spoke of openly, who had made his own fortune abroad through years of hard effort and returned in secret to help the very family that had cast him out, upon the single condition that his name never again be spoken within these walls. But that is only servants' gossip from 40 years past, Mr. Holmes. the sort of story that grows more elaborate with each retelling around a kitchen fire. I would not put any great weight upon it myself, were I in your position." Holmes regarded her steadily for a long moment, his grey eyes betraying nothing of his own private conclusions. "You put a great deal of weight upon it yourself, Miss Thraxworth, or you should not recall the particulars so very precisely after— How many years did you say had passed since you first heard it as a girl?" She did not answer this directly, her lips pressing into a thin, controlled line that told Holmes, I think, a great deal more than any words might have done. "One final question, if you would indulge me," said Holmes, his tone deceptively mild. "Where were you yourself between 9:30 that evening, when Sir Aldous retired to his study, and midnight, when his nephew claims to have seen the 7th chair disturbed from its accustomed place?" "In my own room, reading, as I am every single night of my life in this house. I keep regular and entirely unremarkable habits, Mr. Holmes, whatever you may suspect to the contrary. Alone, throughout that entire period, as I am every night, Mr. Holmes." Her voice had gone noticeably cold, the careful warmth she had earlier extended to her own family history withdrawn entirely. "I think, if you will forgive my bluntness, that you have asked enough questions of an old woman for one single afternoon, and I have household matters that require my attention regardless of your investigation." Chapter 6. The Solicitor's Account. We found Josiah Penrose, the family solicitor, in the manor's library, surrounded by ledgers and legal papers that he was sorting with the brisk, almost nervous efficiency of a man eager to conclude his unpleasant business at Greywater and return as quickly as possible to the comparative safety of London. He was perhaps 55 years of age, dry and precise in manner, with the careful, calculating eyes of one long accustomed to weighing every word before he permitted himself to speak it aloud. "Mr. Holmes," he said, rising to greet us with a thin, professional smile that did not extend to his eyes. "Edmund tells me you doubt the official account of Sir Aldous's death rather strenuously. I confess I find the matter of the locked room more puzzling intellectually than genuinely sinister in its implications. These old houses are full of draughts, settling timbers, and tricks of construction that bewilder the untrained eye far more readily than they suggest any genuine foul play." "Indeed," said Holmes mildly, settling into a chair without removing his gloves, a small signal of distance I had learned to recognize. "Tell me of the will, Mr. Penrose, if you would be so good. You came down from London that particular afternoon, expressly to revise it, I am given to understand?" "I did, yes. Sir Aldous had written to me a fortnight prior, indicating in general terms that he wished to alter certain provisions before the year's end." "What provisions, specifically?" Penrose's mouth tightened almost imperceptibly, the practiced reflex of a man trained from his earliest articles to guard a client's confidences as jealously as his own life. "That, Mr. Holmes, is a confidential matter properly belonging to the relationship between solicitor and client, and I do not feel at liberty to discuss its particulars even now, with my client so recently and tragically deceased. Your client is dead, Mr. Penrose, and his death is presently under the most serious question imaginable. I should remind you, with all proper respect for your profession's traditions, that withholding material information from a death investigation of this gravity is no trivial matter whatsoever, whatever the customary etiquette of your calling might otherwise suggest in ordinary circumstances." The solicitor was silent a long moment, visibly weighing the competing demands of professional discretion and plain self-preservation, then sighed heavily and seemed to deflate somewhat in his chair. "Very well, Mr. Holmes, since you put it so forcefully. Sir Aldous intended, by the terms we discussed, to reduce quite significantly the inheritance due to his brother Mortimer, and to redirect a substantial sum, some £12,000, a very considerable amount by any reckoning, toward a beneficiary he declined to name to me directly even in our private conference, saying only that the bequest concerned an old debt of honour, long overdue for proper settlement." Holmes's eyes flashed with sudden, undisguised interest, and he leaned forward in his chair. The seventh guest, unless I am very much mistaken in the pattern now emerging before me. I could not say with certainty, Mr. Holmes. Sir Aldous was always an exceptionally private man in matters touching his personal business, even with his own solicitor of many years' standing. And did you in fact complete this revision of the will before you yourself retired that particular evening? I did not, no. We discussed the general terms at considerable length after dinner, here in this very library where we now sit, continuing until perhaps 9:30, at which point Sir Aldous said he wished to consider the precise wording further, overnight, alone, and would summon me again the following morning to finalise the document and arrange for its proper witnessing and signature. I retired to my room at 10 o'clock precisely and slept undisturbed throughout the night until I was woken with the dreadful news of his death. And yet, said Holmes softly, watching the solicitor's face with close attention, a signed and apparently properly witnessed will lies even now upon his desk, dated unambiguously to that very night. Penrose went quite visibly pale at this, his hands tightening upon the papers before him. I confess I had not yet personally examined the completed document myself, Mr. Holmes. When I was first told it had been found completed upon his desk, I assumed without further inquiry that he had summoned some servant to witness it privately after I myself had retired, perhaps having written out the final terms himself in the small hours when sleep eluded him, as I am told it often did, toward the end of his life, whose signature appears upon the document as the necessary witness. The solicitor consulted no paper before answering. The answer seemed, indeed, to trouble him a great deal, even before he spoke it aloud. Dr. Crane's signature, Mr. Holmes. Sylvester Crane witnessed the will, according to the document itself. Chapter 7. The Physician's Confession. Dr. Sylvester Crane was a heavy-set man of perhaps 60. With trembling hands he could not quite still even as he poured himself a generous brandy in the smoking room, where Holmes finally tracked him down, having spent some 20 minutes evading us through the corridors of the great house. I judged from his ruddy complexion and the fine network of broken veins about his nose that he had, over the course of many years, formed more than a passing acquaintance with the bottle now trembling in his grip. "I knew you would come to me eventually, Mr. Holmes," he said, before either of us had spoken a single word of greeting, his voice already thick with both brandy and evident distress. "Sit down, both of you, please. I think I had better tell you the truth of the matter before my own conscience does it for me, and rather less kindly than I might manage myself." "I am listening with full attention," said Holmes, settling into a chair with the patient stillness of a man who recognizes a genuine confession approaching and knows better than to hurry it. "Aldous summoned me to his study at perhaps 11 o'clock that night, well after Penrose had retired to his room, you understand. I had not yet gone to bed myself. I rarely sleep well in this house, even after 30 years of visiting it as both friend and physician, for reasons I could not fully explain to you even if pressed. He had the will already before him upon the desk, written out in his own careful hand from the notes he and Penrose had discussed together earlier that evening. He asked me to witness his signature there and then, and being his oldest and closest friend in this world, and his physician besides for above 3 decades, I did not think it especially strange that he should wish the matter concluded quietly, without disturbing the rest of the sleeping household. "You signed the document, then, while he was yet fully alive and in his right mind?" "I did, Mr. Holmes, upon my honour as a physician and as a gentleman. He was perfectly well when I left his company, somewhat agitated in his manner, perhaps, as a man often is after settling such weighty matters, but alive, breathing easily, and in full possession of his faculties. I bid him a final good night at 11:30 precisely, and returned directly to my own room. I have told no living soul of this late visit until this very moment, Mr. Holmes, because—" He hesitated, draining his glass in a single convulsive swallow before continuing, because I feared it would mark me out as the very last man to see him alive, and consequently as a natural suspect in whatever had truly happened to him. "You were not, in fact, the last," said Holmes quietly, his voice carrying a gravity that seemed to still even Crane's trembling hands. "Someone else entered that locked study after you yourself had departed, Dr. Crane. Someone who subsequently locked the door from within, using Sir Aldous' own key, or one identical to it, and who did not depart again by any conventional door or window, as the room's undisturbed physical condition makes entirely plain to careful examination. Tell me now, in your full professional opinion as a physician of 30 years standing, what was the true cause of Sir Aldous' death, setting aside whatever the county surgeon may have concluded in haste?" The county surgeon called it apoplexy, a sudden seizure of the heart brought on, he supposed, by some excitement or strain Aldous had not shared openly with the household. "I confess I am not myself satisfied with that diagnosis, Mr. Holmes, though I signed no formal contradiction to it at the time. God forgive my cowardice in the matter. There was a curious discoloration about his lips that I did not at all care for upon close examination, and there was, besides, a faint but unmistakable odour in the room when the door was finally broken down the following morning. Bitter almonds, Mr. Holmes, or something very closely resembling that particular scent." I started visibly in my chair. "Cyanide, Holmes, that is unmistakable. Or some compound containing it in significant quantity," said Holmes grimly, his expression darkening considerably. "Dr. Crane, why did you not report this critical observation to the proper authorities at once, rather than permit a false verdict of natural death to stand unchallenged for a full week?" The physician's heavy face crumpled with what appeared to be genuine and long-suppressed anguish. "Because, Mr. Holmes, the only persons who might conceivably have administered such a poison to my oldest friend are persons I have myself known and loved my entire adult life, members of a family I have served faithfully for 3 decades, and I could not bear to be the man who set the full machinery of the law upon them without absolute certainty. I am an old fool, perhaps, and a coward besides by your evident reckoning, but I am not, I think, a murderer's willing accomplice, only a frightened old man who has put off an unbearable duty for 7 wretched days, hoping against hope that some other, gentler explanation might yet present itself." Chapter 8. A Second Crime. We dined that evening at Greywater in an atmosphere of suppressed dread that no amount of polished silver or attentive service could disguise, the household by now plainly aware that Holmes's relentless questions cut a great deal closer to the bone than the comfortable fiction of apoplexy had ever allowed them to believe. Conversation faltered repeatedly into long silences, broken only by the scrape of cutlery and the occasional nervous cough, and I noticed that no one, not even Edmund, allowed their gaze to drift toward the 7th chair standing in lonely vigil at the table's foot. It was during the soup course that a manservant entered hurriedly, his face quite drained of colour, and bent low to whisper something urgent into Edmund's ear. Edmund rose so abruptly that his chair toppled backward with a crash that startled the entire table into stunned silence. "It's Penrose," he said, his voice cracking. "He does not answer his door, and Hobbs says there is a strong smell of gas leaking out from beneath it." We rushed up the great staircase together, Holmes leading with long, urgent strides, and found the solicitor's door locked precisely as Sir Aldous' study had been locked 1 week before, a coincidence that struck me, even in the urgency of the moment, with a chill quite separate from the cold of the corridor. Holmes did not hesitate this time, as he had with the first door. He put his shoulder to the wood with a force that genuinely surprised me in so lean a frame, and on the second, tremendous blow, the lock gave way entirely, the door crashing inward. Josiah Penrose lay sprawled upon the bed, fully dressed even to his boots, his face an alarming and ghastly shade of grey-blue, the gas lamp beside him, hissing softly with its flame long since extinguished, the room thick with the unmistakable, sickly sweet odour of escaping coal gas. I rushed to him immediately, my medical training overriding every other consideration, and found, to my profound and immediate relief, a pulse beneath my fingers, faint, irregular, but unmistakably present. "He lives," I said urgently, already working to loosen his collar. "Open every window, for God's sake, and get him into clean air at once before the gas claims what remains of his senses entirely." Between us, Holmes and I carried Penrose bodily to the now open window, and within the space of perhaps an hour, with the application of stimulants from my medical bag and repeated applications of cold water to his face and wrists, I had the considerable satisfaction of watching colour slowly return to his cheeks and his breathing gradually steady into something approaching normalcy. He would live, I judged with growing confidence, though he would not speak with any coherence that particular night, his mind still clouded by the gas he had inhaled. Holmes, meanwhile, had remained near the bed only long enough to satisfy himself of Penrose's survival before turning his full attention to the room itself, his expression dark as a gathering thundercloud, examining the gas fitting beside the bed with the minute, almost forensic attention he brought to every physical clue. "The valve was not in any way faulty, Watson, nor accidentally disturbed by a careless or fumbling hand," he said, kneeling beside the brass fitting with his glass. "It has been quite deliberately opened, turned fully to its furthest extent, well beyond any point a man undressing carelessly for bed might leave it through simple oversight. Observe also," he held up a small scrap of paper he had discovered tucked deliberately beneath the pillow, identical in stock and in hand to the torn fragment we had earlier found in Sir Aldous' wastepaper basket. This second note, however, remained entirely intact, and read in full, in that same cramped, hurried script. "I know what you did to the ledger. The 7th chair will be filled tonight, and you shall answer to it before the dawn. A warning," I said, examining the note over his shoulder with mounting unease. Penrose received this threat somehow, and perhaps panicked entirely, attempting to take his own life by gas rather than face whatever exposure the note threatened him with. "Or," said Holmes slowly, his eyes narrowing with calculation, "someone wished us very specifically to believe precisely that convenient explanation, Watson, and has gone to no small trouble to construct it for our benefit. This affair is no longer merely a matter of one uncertain death by ambiguous means, however suspicious. It is now, quite unmistakably and beyond any reasonable doubt, a second attempt at murder. And I begin, at last, to perceive the true shape of the truth beneath this elaborate construction, though I confess 2 crucial pieces of the puzzle yet elude my grasp entirely. We must speak with Mortimer Thraxworth this very night, before he has any further opportunity to compose and rehearse his answers to the questions I intend to put to him. Chapter 9. The Brothers' Ledger. Mortimer Thraxworth received us in a state of barely controlled agitation that no amount of practiced composure could fully disguise, having heard already, through the rapid currency of household gossip, of the dreadful attack upon Penrose not 2 hours past. He was a narrower, more nervous and less physically robust version of his late brother, with the soft, uncalloused hands of a man who had made his entire living at a desk rather than in any more active pursuit, and eyes that would not quite meet Holmes's steady gaze for more than a few seconds at a stretch. "I had absolutely nothing to do with either matter, Mr. Holmes. I swear it before God and all his angels." "I have made no accusation whatsoever, Mr. Thraxworth," said Holmes evenly, settling into a chair with deliberate calm, clearly intended to encourage, rather than further alarm, his nervous host. "I have come only to ask after a certain ledger, one your late brother referenced explicitly in a torn note discovered in his own wastepaper basket, written, I should judge from internal evidence, upon the very night he died. The truth of the ledger," he wrote, before the sentence was abruptly interrupted, perhaps by an unexpected knock upon his study door. "Tell me now, in full and without further evasion, of this ledger and its significance. Mortimer's careful composure cracked visibly at this direct demand, his hands beginning to tremble against the arms of his chair. It concerns the general management of the family's various investments, which I have personally overseen these past 9 years on my late brother's behalf and trust. There were certain irregularities, Mr. Holmes, in the accounts. Small at first, scarcely worth troubling Aldous' attention with, but compounding steadily over the years into a sum considerably larger than I ever dared confess to him directly. Aldous discovered the full extent of the discrepancy only some 3 weeks past, quite by accident during a routine review, and demanded from me a complete and immediate accounting of every shilling. I believe now that this discovery was the true and underlying purpose of his revised will, not merely the old seventh chair tradition that Penrose described to you, but a deliberate and substantial reduction of my own rightful inheritance, calculated precisely to recover what I had. I will use the honest word, Mr. Holmes, however much it shames me, misappropriated from the family's trust over the years. How much, precisely, Mr. Thraxworth, did this misappropriation ultimately amount to? Some £8,000 all told, accumulated gradually over a period of roughly 6 years. His voice had fallen to barely above a whisper, his eyes fixed upon the carpet rather than upon either of us. And on the night your brother died, did you speak with him privately at any point during the evening? Briefly, yes. After dinner had concluded, in the hall outside the dining room, he told me directly, without any softening of the blow, that he intended to finalize his new will that very night, and that I should expect a substantially reduced inheritance as a direct consequence of my conduct, though he assured me, with what I took at the time for genuine mercy, that he would not expose me publicly to the wider family or to the law, provided I made full restitution of the misappropriated sum within the coming year. I left his company at perhaps 10 o'clock that evening, Mr. Holmes, and went directly to my own room in considerable distress. I did not see him alive again. Did any other soul in this house see you go directly to your room as you claim, or can any servant or family member confirm your whereabouts thereafter? A long, uncomfortable silence followed this pointed question. No, Mortimer admitted finally, his shoulders sinking. No one saw me at all that night, Mr. Holmes. I was, as I so often am in this house, entirely alone. Chapter 10. The Stranger's Identity. That night, as the household at Greywater settled into a fitful and uneasy sleep, the events of the evening pressing heavily upon every soul beneath its roof, Holmes sat long before the dying fire in our guest chamber, his pipe glowing steadily in the darkness, like a small, patient ember, turning over in his mind, I knew without needing to ask, every separate thread of the intricate tapestry now spread before him. "Watson," he said at last, breaking a silence that had stretched above half an hour, "let us reason through, with proper method, precisely what we now possess in the way of established fact, setting aside speculation entirely for the moment. A locked study, in which a man dies of what I now believe, with considerable confidence, to be cyanide poisoning, administered at some point between 11:30, when Dr. Crane left him demonstrably alive and in good spirits, and 7 the following morning, when his body was discovered by his valet, and yet the door was locked from within by the dead man's own key, the window fused immovably shut by a decade's accumulated rust, the chimney far too narrow to permit the passage of any grown man. A will, apparently completed and properly witnessed after Sir Aldous' true hour of death, given the demonstrable freshness of the ink upon its signature, a family legend, faithfully maintained across 30 years, of an unseen guest to whom some old and unspecified debt is perpetually owed. A chair seen disturbed in the dead of night by the victim's own son, as though occupied briefly by someone unseen by any other witness. A brother discovered embezzling family funds, his crime exposed on the very same night as the murder. A solicitor attacked precisely 1 week later, with a note left deliberately referencing that very same 7th chair. What single thread, Watson, connects all these separate and seemingly disparate elements into one coherent whole? Someone who knows this house with genuine intimacy, I ventured, after some consideration of my own. Someone capable of moving through it largely unseen by the family proper, who knew the true history behind the old legend rather than merely its sanitized nursery version, and who had pressing cause to fear both Sir Aldous' revised will and Penrose's growing knowledge of its true terms and origins. Good, Watson. Genuinely good reasoning, and you progress in this art rather more rapidly than you yourself give yourself credit for. Now, tell me this. Who among this entire household fits that precise description, and who alone possesses some connection to the true, unvarnished story of the seventh chair that none of the others fully possess, whatever fragments of servants' gossip they may have absorbed over the years? I confess, turning the question over in my own mind, that I had no satisfactory answer to offer him. "Tomorrow," said Holmes, rising at last and knocking the ash from his pipe against the cold grate, "we shall visit the parish church first, and after that the county records office in Pellinghurst itself. I have formed a distinct suspicion regarding the disinherited cousin of whom Agatha Thraxworth spoke this afternoon with such carefully measured reluctance, and so I should very much like to test that suspicion against the cold, impartial evidence of public record before we proceed further. A man cast out of a family rarely vanishes entirely from this earth, Watson, however thoroughly his name is subsequently struck from the household Bible by those who wish him forgotten." Chapter 11. The Parish Records. The vicar of Pellinghurst, an elderly clergyman named Reverend Hollis, who had served the parish faithfully above 40 years, and remembered, I should think, every christening and burial within that span with equal clarity, proved a remarkable font of local memory, once Holmes's careful and patient questions had loosened his naturally cautious tongue. "The Thraxworth family," he said, leading us through the cold stone church to a dusty vestry where the old parish registers were kept in their heavy leather bindings, "has more than the single branch you gentlemen will be familiar with from the manor, though you would scarcely know it to speak with the present generation, who I suspect have heard little of this older history themselves. There was a younger brother to old Josiah Thraxworth, Edmund's own great-uncle, that would make him, if my reckoning of the generations serves me correctly, named Cassius, a wild, headstrong young man by every account I have ever heard, who fell into considerable disgrace over a matter of cards and accumulated gambling debt sometime in the 1850s, and was consequently sent abroad in some haste, his very name struck from family conversation thereafter, as though he had never existed at all." Holmes leaned forward sharply at this, his interest plainly engaged. "Did this Cassius leave any descendants behind him, Reverend, before his departure or during it?" "A son, yes. I baptized the boy myself, in some secrecy, at his poor mother's tearful pleading, before the wider family could prevent the ceremony or insist upon some quieter, less public arrangement." The vicar consulted the yellowed register before him, running a trembling, ink-stained finger down the faded columns of careful copperplate. "Here it is, gentlemen, recorded in my own predecessor's hand, though I assisted at the actual ceremony as a young curate new to the parish. Baptized in the year 1856, name of Algernon Cassius Thraxworth. The mother is listed only as Mary of this parish, no surname given, no father's name recorded at all, by the express and insistent request of the wider family, though I can assure you every soul in this village knew perfectly well whose child the boy truly was, whatever the official record might decline to state." "What ultimately became of this Algernon, so far as your own knowledge extends?" "He was sent away to relatives in the colonies as quite a young boy, I believe, after his poor mother died of a fever some years later, left entirely alone in the world, so far as I ever heard, the family having washed their hands of the whole unfortunate business. I never heard another word of him for many years thereafter, until, now that you press me to recall it properly, some 2 years past, A man of approximately the right age came through this very village, asking a number of careful questions about the Thraxworth family's history. Tall, dark-haired, somewhat foreign in his manner of dress, though he spoke perfectly fluent English without trace of any accent. He gave me no name at the time, and I confess I thought him merely some curious traveller interested in old county families, as such travellers occasionally are. When precisely was this visit, as nearly as you can recall it? 2 years past, perhaps a little more. He took lodging for a full fortnight at the Pellinghurst Arms in the village itself, under the name of Mr. Alger Cass, which I confess I did not connect to the family name of Thraxworth until this very moment you have pressed me upon it, Mr. Holmes, though I see the connection plainly enough now that you have led my own thoughts toward it so carefully. Holmes's eyes gleamed with that particular, unmistakable light I had learned over many cases to recognize as the herald of an imminent breakthrough. Watson, I do believe we have at last found our 7th guest in living flesh and blood, not legend at all, and very much closer to Greywater Manor at this present moment than anyone within that troubled household has yet cared to admit to us, whether through ignorance or deliberate concealment. Chapter 12. The Gardener's Cottage. It was Holmes's careful inquiry at the Pellinghurst Arms, where the innkeeper recalled Mr. Cass, with unusual and gratifying clarity, owing chiefly to a generous tip the stranger had left upon his eventual departure 2 years past, that yielded the final crucial thread connecting our investigation. The man had, the innkeeper recalled with growing confidence as his memory was gently prompted, taken to walking the lanes near Greywater Manor each evening during his fortnight's stay, and had once asked directions specifically to the manor's gardener's cottage, a small dwelling at the furthest edge of the estate occupied. We now learned through careful inquiry of the household staff, by a reclusive employee named Gregory Vane, who had come to work for Sir Aldous some 18 months prior, hired, curiously, and against every ordinary custom of the house, without the usual references, upon Sir Aldous's own personal authority and insistence alone. Sir Aldous knew, Holmes said, as we made our way through the dripping yew alley toward the cottage in the gathering dusk, lantern raised against the deepening gloom. He recognized, by whatever means, his own disinherited uncle's grandson, or else was told plainly of his true identity by the man himself, and rather than expose the old family scandal publicly to a judgmental county, he quietly took the man into his own employ, close enough to honour the old lingering debt of conscience that had evidently troubled him for years, distant enough to maintain the comfortable fiction before the rest of his unsuspecting family. It is, I think, precisely the sort of private, guilty penance a fundamentally decent but cowardly aristocrat might construct for his own conscience. The cottage stood dark and silent when we arrived, and a careful search of its single modest room revealed it recently and hastily abandoned. A half-packed valise left open upon the narrow bed, cold ashes in the small grate, and, crucially, a small glass vial, entirely empty, bearing the unmistakable bitter almond residue Holmes identified at once with grim and immediate satisfaction. "Potassium cyanide, beyond any reasonable doubt," he said, holding the vial up to the lantern's flickering light. "And here, Watson, look closely." Tucked beneath a loose floorboard he had detected by sound alone, tapping methodically across the floor, he drew out a small tin box containing a great many letters, dozens of them in all, spanning a full decade or more, written in Sir Aldous's own careful hand and addressed consistently to "My dear nephew," acknowledging financial support sent quietly and secretly over many years, and referencing, with increasing visible anxiety in the later correspondence, the matter you wish settled before I die, which I have not yet found the courage to face publicly, though God knows in my heart you deserve your rightful name and your rightful portion of this family's fortune. "The seventh chair," I murmured, the full weight of the revelation settling over me. "It was never truly a legend at all, Holmes. It was kept, quite literally and quite deliberately, for him alone. "And on the night of the fateful dinner," said Holmes, his voice low and unusually grave, "I believe Gregory Vane, or Algernon Thraxworth, to give him at last his true and proper name, did indeed sit in that very chair, Watson, though no one in the dining-room saw him do it, for the simple and elegant reason that he was already inside the house that night, employed openly as a humble servant, free to come and go entirely unremarked through the old servants' passages that connect to every principal room in this rambling old pile, including, I have no doubt whatsoever, Sir Aldous' own private study." Chapter 13. The Trap. Holmes did not pursue Vane directly that same night, judging correctly that a frightened, cornered man might prove dangerous, or might simply vanish into the surrounding countryside, lost to justice entirely. Instead, he composed a short, carefully worded note, which he had delivered by a trusted stable-boy to every public house and inn within a 5-mile radius of the manor, offering, in terms calculated precisely to reach the ears of a desperate and long-suffering man, that the gentleman who has been inquiring after the Thraxworth inheritance matter might find genuine satisfaction by presenting himself at Greywater Manor the following evening, where the late Sir Aldous' true final wishes would at last be read aloud in full and properly honoured before the assembled family. "It is a considerable risk, Holmes," I said, as we waited together in the darkened dining-room that following evening. The rest of the household gathered uneasily in the drawing-room beyond, deliberately kept unaware of the trap Holmes had so carefully laid. "It is a calculated risk, Watson, which is an altogether different matter entirely," Holmes replied evenly, his eyes fixed upon the shadowed doorway leading toward the servants' passages. "A man who has waited the whole of his adult life for the simple recognition he believes himself rightfully owed, and who has already killed once in pursuit of it, will not easily resist the tempting promise that it has finally, truly become his at last. Watch the 7th chair closely, Watson, and keep your revolver ready to hand at all times." We had not long to wait in the cold, expectant darkness. At 9:30 precisely, the very same hour at which Sir Aldous had bid his family their final good night 1 week before, the door from the servants' passage eased open without a sound, and a tall, dark-haired man slipped into the dining-room with the silent, practised ease of one long intimately familiar with its secret and hidden ways. He moved directly and without hesitation to the 7th chair, and, with an expression of such naked longing and unguarded grief upon his face, that I confess my own heart misgave me considerably, even as I recognized him plainly for a murderer, drew the chair carefully out, and sat himself down in it at last. "Good evening, Mr. Algernon Thraxworth," said Holmes, stepping deliberately from the shadow of the great sideboard, his lamp raised high. "Or should I say instead, welcome, at long, long last, to your own father's table." The man's careful composure shattered instantly and completely. He rose half from the chair in a single violent motion, his hand darting toward the inside of his coat, and I levelled my revolver at him before he could complete whatever desperate motion he had intended. "I would not if I were you," I said quietly, my finger steady upon the trigger. "Sit back down, sir, and do so slowly." Chapter 14. The Truth of the 7th Chair. He sat back down slowly, all the fight gone out of him in a single instant, replaced almost immediately by something closer to exhausted, bottomless relief. The unmistakable look, I have since reflected many times, of a man who has carried some terrible secret for so very long that its discovery comes to him almost as a form of mercy rather than catastrophe. "How did you know?" he asked at last, his voice low and strangely cultured for a man who had spent 18 months posing convincingly as a humble gardener. The torn fragment of paper discovered in Sir Aldous' own wastepaper basket spoke explicitly of a ledger and of some truth he could no longer bear to leave concealed, said Holmes, settling unhurriedly into the chair directly opposite him. "I believed at first, quite naturally, that this referred solely to his brother Mortimer's embezzlement of family funds. But a man planning merely to alter his will in order to recover stolen money does not write of the truth with such evident anguish in his own hand. That is unmistakably the language of a man confessing some far deeper and far older wrong to his own conscience. Combined with your family's curious and stubbornly maintained tradition of the seventh chair, and Reverend Hollis's careful memory of a disinherited branch of the Thraxworth line stretching back 40 years, the true shape of this entire matter became clear to me. You are Algernon, son of Cassius Thraxworth, are you not, brought quietly into Sir Aldous' own employ once he discovered your true identity, supported secretly and generously for years thereafter, but never once publicly acknowledged before the wider world as the family member you truly were. He promised me, Algernon said, his carefully cultured voice finally breaking under the weight of long-suppressed emotion, that he would right the terrible wrong done to both my grandfather and my own father before he himself died, that he would restore our rightful name, provide for me properly as a true son of this house, not as a servant skulking about in a gardener's cottage, taking secret payments like some common blackmailer rather than an acknowledged relation. And then I learned, from a careless word of Penrose's that I overheard quite by accident through the study window, which I had taken to cracking open many nights, listening in the darkness, hoping against hope to hear my own fate finally discussed and settled, that the new will he intended to sign that very night reduced my own inheritance to a mere pitiful annuity, while his brother Mortimer, who had actually stolen outright from him, was to be merely reprimanded rather than properly disinherited as I had been faithfully promised for years he would be. A lifetime of careful secrecy and bitter humiliation, Mr. Holmes, and still I was to remain a mere afterthought beside a common thief who shared his blood legitimately, while I, who shared that very same blood just as truly and just as completely, was condemned to remain hidden away in permanent shame. And so you entered through the passage you had long since discovered for yourself, while Dr. Crane yet sat with him in conversation and waited patiently in the darkness until the good doctor finally withdrew for the night. I waited, yes. I confronted him directly once we were alone. I begged him, Mr. Holmes, quite literally upon my knees before him, to honour his solemn promise in full at last, to acknowledge me openly as his nephew, not merely continue paying me in shameful secret. He refused me even then, Mr. Holmes. He said plainly that the resulting scandal would ruin Edmund's own prospects in society and could therefore not possibly be permitted, whatever debt of honour he privately owed me. I had carried the poison concealed upon my person for many months by that point, you understand, never truly intending to use it upon another living soul, only as a private means of escape for myself, should my own despair ever prove entirely too great to bear alone. But in that single terrible moment, hearing him choose his legitimate son's social comfort over my own entire lifetime of deliberate erasure, something within me broke beyond all repair. I put the poison into his brandy, while his back was momentarily turned toward me, fetching the very will he meant to honour only in cold legal provision, never in any genuine spirit of acknowledgement. I then sat myself in the very chair that had stood empty for me my entire life, watching him die before me, and I felt, God forgive me for it, Mr. Holmes, for I do not forgive myself. I felt in that terrible moment that some manner of justice had finally, truly been done, and the will itself, found signed and properly dated that same night, witnessed earlier by Dr. Crane before you yourself ever arrived in the study. I altered nothing whatsoever of its actual terms, Mr. Holmes. I possessed neither the necessary skill for such forgery, nor, I confess freely, by that point in the evening, any remaining will of my own to delay matters further. I left the document precisely as it already stood. It was the old legend itself I sought finally to fulfill that night, not the material inheritance. I wished, for one single night only, to sit openly at that table, as a true Thraxworth, seen or unseen by the world beyond, before I vanished from this country forever. I locked the study door behind me using a servant's master key, which fits every lock throughout this entire house without exception, and returned the way I had come, believing the locked room would forever conceal what I had done within it. And Penrose, a full week later, what drove you to attack him in turn? Algernon's face darkened with visible, genuine shame at this final question. He discovered, while going carefully through old estate correspondence to properly settle the will's administration, a letter referencing the gardener's true parentage that Sir Aldous had carelessly left among his private papers years before and never thought to destroy. Penrose came to me directly about it, not yet entirely certain what he had stumbled upon, merely confused and curious, but I panicked entirely, certain in my own terror that he meant to expose me publicly before I had even properly decided what I myself intended to do next. I went to his room that night, meaning only to question him quietly and perhaps reason with him, found him already retired for the night, and in my own mounting terror, turned the gas valve fully open rather than risk his eventual testimony against me. I left the note behind deliberately, hoping to make the whole affair appear instead a matter of guilt over the ledger scandal, hoping suspicion would consequently fall upon Mortimer in my place. The room fell entirely silent but for the soft, steady hiss of the dining room fire. Holmes regarded the broken man before him with an expression I had rarely seen upon his sharp features in all our years of acquaintance. Not triumph at having solved the case, but something closer to a weary, deeply complicated sorrow. "You have committed murder, Mr. Thraxworth, and have attempted a second besides," Holmes said quietly but firmly, "and for both these grave crimes, the law must now properly take its course. Whatever genuine sympathy your tragic history may justly command from any fair-minded observer. But I will say this much, for whatever small comfort it may offer you in the dark months ahead, the chair was always rightfully yours, whatever this cowardly family chose to believe or pretend otherwise. The legend your family invented across 2 generations to soothe its own troubled conscience was, in the very end, simply the unvarnished truth, badly and incompletely told." Chapter 15. Aftermath. Algernon Thraxworth was taken into custody by the Surrey Constabulary that same night without offering the slightest further resistance, and was tried the following spring at the Surrey Assizes before a packed and curious courtroom. The jury evidently moved as much by the extraordinary and genuinely tragic history of his family's prolonged cruelty toward him as by the stark clarity of the evidence Holmes had so carefully assembled, returned a verdict of guilty to manslaughter rather than outright murder upon the matter of Sir Aldous' death, citing diminished responsibility brought on by a lifetime of profound psychological injury. Though the separate charge of attempted murder against Penrose, who recovered fully from his ordeal and testified with evident and painful reluctance, secured a sentence that would keep Algernon from any liberty for the better part of 2 full decades. Mortimer Thraxworth made full and complete restitution of the embezzled funds under the credible threat of separate prosecution, which Edmund, in a gesture that did him considerable credit in Holmes's eyes, chose ultimately not to pursue further, preferring instead to preserve what remained of his family's battered reputation from any further public ruin. He married Iris Whitfield the following autumn in a quiet ceremony attended by few beyond the immediate family, and I am reliably told that the 7th chair has, since that dreadful November, been quietly and permanently removed from the Greywater dining table altogether. The family's long-maintained superstition finally, and mercifully, retired along with the terrible secret it had concealed for 30 long years. As our train pulled slowly away from Pellinghurst Station into the gathering evening dusk, I turned to Holmes, who sat watching the darkening Surrey fields slide past the carriage window with an expression of unusual and uncharacteristic thoughtfulness. "A strange case altogether, Holmes," I said at last, breaking our companionable silence. I confess I find myself considerably more troubled by its final solution than genuinely relieved by it, whatever justice has technically been served. Chapter 16. Holmes's Reflection. "It is the particular nature of the very deepest crimes, Watson," Holmes said at length, his pipe glowing steadily in the dim carriage light, "that they are exceedingly rarely born of pure, simple wickedness alone. Algernon Thraxworth was no monster in any meaningful sense of that word. He was a man quite deliberately manufactured, across 2 full generations, by the calculated cruelty of others, set apart entirely from his own rightful name for the shallow comfort of a family far too cowardly to ever face its own troubled history honestly and openly. Sir Aldous meant well enough, in his own limited and guilt-ridden fashion, but a kindness offered only in permanent secret, hedged about on every side with shame and concealment, is scarcely any true kindness at all in the final accounting. It is merely guilt, dressed up carefully in somewhat better clothing than it properly deserves. Then who is truly guilty in this whole sorry affair? In your own considered estimation, Holmes, Algernon himself, for the poison he ultimately administered, or the wider family, for the generations of silence that gradually drove him to such a desperate and terrible act? Both parties, Watson, and that uncomfortable truth is precisely what makes the law such a blunt and imperfect instrument when applied to the far subtler crimes of the human heart. I can identify a murderer with complete and satisfying certainty, given sufficient evidence and sufficient time. I cannot so easily identify the precise moment, 2 full generations in the past, when one family's small, private cowardice first became a debt that could ultimately only be repaid in blood. He drew thoughtfully upon his pipe, his sharp eyes distant and unfocused in the dim carriage light. The 7th chair was never truly empty for a single night in 30 years, Watson. Whatever the family chose to believe, it was occupied, every single night without exception, by a grievance that no one in that entire house ever found the simple courage to name aloud. That, I rather think, is the one mystery in this whole sorry affair that no court of law will ever satisfactorily resolve, however just its final verdict may prove to be. He said nothing further of any substance until London's familiar lights rose at last to meet us through the deepening darkness, and I confess freely that of all the singular and remarkable cases I have had the considerable privilege to chronicle in the course of my long association with Sherlock Holmes, none has left me with quite so heavy and reflective a heart as the strange and genuinely sorrowful affair of Greywater Manor's 7th, long unseen guest. The end.